One of the most common claims that Ehrman makes about the Gospels themselves are that they were not written by those names that are on them. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are written by anonymous authors late in the first century. We don't know who these people are, according to Ehrman. They're people that were probably Hellenistic writers outside of Palestine, simply putting down the stories that they had heard about Jesus. They weren't eyewitnesses, and we can't be assured that what they're telling us really took place. Now, that claim is reiterated often by Ehrman, but there's only one thing that supports that claim. And that only thing that supports that claim is that in the Gospels themselves, they're what we call formally anonymous. What that means is in the text itself, it doesn't say John wrote this or Matthew wrote this. So if you read a letter of Paul, it does tell you that Paul's name is attached to it, but the Gospels are formally anonymous. Now, should that be a concern? Well, actually not. When we think about ancient biographies often were formally anonymous. So the Gospels, leaving the names of the author outside the text formally, is not at all unusual. So then how do you know who wrote these books? Well, several ways that we conclude that the authors that wrote them are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it's simply this. First, the titles of the books. One of the things that Ehrman wants to claim is that the titles that are attached to these documents were added late, probably well into the 2nd century, if not late 2nd century. That's when these titles were added. But that runs into a number of problems. Our earliest manuscripts of these gospel texts all have the titles attached to them, and we can see them. So as far back as we can see, these gospels had the titles with them. But moreover, one has to ask the question, if these titles were a late addition, how is it that we have such uniformity in what these documents were called? If Matthew's Gospel, for example, wasn't called Matthew's Gospel until late in the 2nd century, then why don't we have a number of copies of Matthew's Gospels with different titles, with different names? In fact, we don't possess that. What we find is incredible uniformity across the board of the titles of these Gospels. Matthew's Gospel is called Matthew, Mark's is called Mark's. It's amazingly consistent, something we would not expect if the titles were added later. Another thing that indicates the titles were added early is the fact that we have Mark and Luke included in the list of titles. One of the things that we know was happening in the 2nd century is that when apocryphal Gospels were written, often titles would be picked that had some of the most popular names attached to them. So you have something like the Gospel of Peter, which was an apocryphal Gospel. People wanted to attach the most popular apostles' names to their Gospels to try to give them extra sort of authority. So if names were arbitrarily chosen for these Gospels in the 2nd century, why would they pick Mark and Luke? These were hardly the most popular figures in early Christianity. There's no reason to think that that would have been an extra boost for any particular Gospel. These aren't the names we would expect to be picked if, in fact, they were arbitrarily picked in the middle to late 2nd century. In fact, we know from other sources that Mark's Gospel is actually the testimony of Peter. Now, Mark claims that what he's writing down is, in fact, Peter's words. If so, why not call Mark's Gospel the Gospel of Peter? That makes much more sense. But instead, what we find is it retains the title, the Gospel of Mark, even though that's not the most famous figure you could give to that book. That suggests historical integrity. It suggests modesty. It suggests truth. It suggests that the titles we have of these Gospels very much are the titles of the actual people who wrote them. There's actually more evidence than that for why we know the Gospels are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that is we have very strong patristic testimony in this regard. Papias, who was an early church bishop in the early 2nd century, tells us and confirms for us that Matthew was the author of Matthew and Mark was the author of Mark. Papias was said to have heard the Gospel of John preach. If so, then he's only one step removed from the apostles themselves. Also, church father by the name of Irenaeus in the late 2nd century tells us that these 4 Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Where would Irenaeus have gotten his information from? Well, we're told in the other early Christian writings that Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. And Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle himself. So whatever Irenaeus tells us about the authors of the Gospels, most likely he got that from Polycarp, who got that from the Apostle John. That is a very reliable historical sequence. There are very good reasons to think that Irenaeus knows better who the Gospel authors are than modern scholars. And so if we take him at his word, we have every reason to think the Gospels are written by the names that are attached to them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.